Okay, so welcome everybody to this 7th session of the IAPS at a Distance calendar of sessions that IAPS is holding. Today, the topic of the session is advocacy in physics. And with us, we have Jennifer Greenamoyer of the American Institute of Physics, AIP, and Maikel Rheinstädter of the Canadian Association of Physics, CAP. So welcome to you both, and thank you very much for accepting our invite to participate in this session. Now I will proceed to just presenting you short bios of our speakers, and then we will move to the presentation or talk that each speaker will give to initiate the discussion on our topic. So Jennifer Greenamoyer is AIP's principal lobbyist, working to assist member societies with development and implementation of government relations initiatives. She regularly represents AIP to Congress and other policymakers to forward science policy interests and works with the S&T community to influence policy developments and lobby for appropriations. In addition, Jen manages AIP's Congressional and State Department fellowship programs. Dr. Maikel Rheinstädter is the Director of Science Policy of the Canadian Association of Physicists. He is a professor in the Department of Physics and Astronomy at McMaster University. He is also serving as the Associate Chair of Graduate Studies, Director of the Origins of Life Laboratory, and Associate Director of the Origins Institute. Dr. Rheinstädter is a biophysicist. His research is in the field of membrane biophysics and the role of membranes in infectious and neurodegenerative diseases. He is founder of SynthMed, a spin-off company that develops blood-based sensors. So once again, thank you for being in this session. And now I will give the word to Jen to present about AIP.
Okay, so I'll try and share my screen. We'll see how this goes. Are you seeing anything?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Is it? Yeah, I think I'm gonna have to. I'm not sure if it's showing you guys the slides or the speaker's view at this point.
It's showing the view, yeah.
Okay. Okay, there we go. Yeah.
Perfect.
Okay, great, thanks. All right, thanks so much for having me. It's always really exciting to talk to student groups. And I'll talk a little bit more about that kind of as I go along through my presentation. So I just have about 10 slides, and it's really just to help keep me on track in terms of what I want to talk about. But I thought I'd just let you know a little bit about the American Institute of Physics. We are a federation, which means that we're kind of an umbrella organization where societies are our members. So we have 10 scientific societies that belong to the American Institute of Physics as the umbrella for physics. And what this means for me is that I do my job a little bit differently than organizations like yours that have individual members. And so if you can think about doing a letter writing campaign and you would kind of reach into your full membership, that's different for me. My membership is 10 societies. And so I work with these societies to help forward their goals. And then we also, AIP has some initiatives that we do independently to help complement the efforts of our member societies. Okay, so you've heard a little bit about me, and I think that the point here is just that I'm happy to answer any questions that anybody might have about kind of any other jobs that I've had before in terms of being a congressional staff person, working at the Environmental Protection Agency, or anything that you might want to know about fellowships or our fellowship program. So this is how I like to try and talk about my job with people. And it's, there's Washington, D.C. crowd, and then there's kind of, you know, the scientific community. And largely the way that I like to think about it is that there's a cultural divide. And I think that when you start thinking about it in those terms, you can have more of a positive advocacy approach. And so that's kind of the way that I encourage people to do it. So if you think about kind of building a bridge more in terms of when you're doing advocacy, I think that that's really helpful. And I'll kind of go through and just talk to you a little bit about my frame in terms of different cultures. But, you know, as you all well know, when you start thinking about different cultures, right, they have different language, they have different values, they have different traditions. And, you know, so there's all of those things that kind of wrap into how you think about doing your advocacy. So just keep going here. So part of this is, you know, when you're thinking about in the US anyway, for the United States Congress, is that there are 535 members of Congress. Less than 5% of them have any background in science. So you have a few hundred lawyers, and then, you know, on the technical side, you have maybe 20 MDs. You have one PhD physicist, one PhD mathematician. You have probably about 25 people that don't have any education above a high school education in Congress. And so it's just really interesting to look into people's backgrounds. It's in theory a representation of the population in the United States. But there's a lot to that, and sometimes that happens and sometimes it doesn't. But when you're thinking about kind of the cultural divide here, I'm just wanted to kind of plant the seeds here for how to think about politicians and how different they are from the scientific community. Certainly, members of Congress are strongly influenced by the news cycle, by public opinion. They're not technical people, so they're not necessarily good with digesting numbers or quantitative things. And certainly different terms that we commonly use in science mean different things to them. And so the graph that you see on the right here is it's public meaning and scientific term, but you can kind of use that public meaning as essentially the same level at which Congress is going to come in at. So your typical kind of 8th grade level. But it's always interesting to me, you know, I was a graduate student in oceanography and I turned into a policy wonk later. And I think back to my training and remember how important it was to, you know, carry through errors or, you know, name anomalies. And, you know, kind of these are just things that we say every day and are incredibly important to us. And I think it's really easy to forget that they mean different things to different people. So part of when you're thinking about kind of this cultural divide and bridging the cultural divide is you know, having a map or having a guide. And so this is just one of the ways that I kind of represent the political forces kind of when I'm thinking through things or when I'm talking to people. There are lots of things that go into decision making in a policymaker's world, right? And so if you're putting yourself kind of into their world, you're thinking about how all of these things on the screen are kind of coming together. And so I would just say, use this kind of tool to your advantage, right? And kind of research the background of your policymakers so that you can talk to them in terms of their values. And so if you think of these gears as, you know, kind of certain things are more important at other times than others. So like the size of these gears and then the spinning of these gears is different depending on what kind of your political climate is or what you're trying to accomplish. For me, I just was gonna, in terms of this slide, the most important ones that I see kind of oftentimes driving the conversation would be party politics. That's a big deal for in the US for the Democratic and Republican Party members. And certainly the news. Congress is incredibly reactionary to the news. And then constituents. So I put constituents as three, but I would say news and party politics often trump a lot of the other driving forces in politics. This I could talk about all day, but I'm just gonna mention that part of when you're thinking about bridging the cultural divide is to kind of know your audience, which is kind of what we talked about earlier. And then the other one is one of the other things would be to know kind of what environment you might be walking into. So this is kind of like the political climate, right? And so today's political climate is what I call hyper political, right? So this is something that we've kind of seen happening over time. So if you look back from the 90s to today, you can track kind of the number of bills that have passed through our US Congress, right? And it's gone down, down, down. And then you can talk about, our deficits, our budget numbers and the budget pressures, and that has gone kind of up, up, up. And then, there's different organizations that kind of track things and rate them on how partisan they are, how political they are, and you can see that going up, up, up. And so I think a lot of us that have been working in policy for a while, we're kind of wondering, when is this going to come to a pinch point of some sort? And I would say here we are. And so, we did see it coming, I think, but what's important to me as a lobbyist and important to me in doing advocacy is to know what it really means, right? Because you're in there talking to your elected representatives, and you need to understand the pressures that they're under. And so for politicians, it really means that everything's under a microscope right now. I mean, you've got all these news stations. You certainly have a lot of party people that are kind of ready to jump on any kind of attacks or arguments. So every single thing that a politician does these days is examined and maybe amplified even, and certainly there's a lot of scorecards that are kept by interest groups and organizations in the US. And so each politician has to weigh very carefully what they do so that they're not kind of inadvertently inviting a landslide of attention to that action. And so, it's usually best when you go in with advocacy, you go in with partners, maybe a diversity of people from your community, so that you can kind of show your congressional representative that there's a unified position on this. And I try and, that's where we try and come in. I mean, we're a federation, but it also, there's strength when you can show unification. And so with our community in the US, there's kind of a trifecta. And so it would be, if you could go into Congress with scientific societies, academic and academic institutions, I kind of almost count that as one, along with industry, scientific societies, universities, and industry. And if you came in with that, with representatives from each of those groups, that makes a really strong statement to Congress. And so that's a lot of what we try and do, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But just think about for yourself, what does it mean that you're operating in a hyper-political environment? And then for me, I always kind of think about this in terms of constituents, kind of a new car syndrome is what I call it, is in terms of, whenever you get a new car, new computer or something like that, you start seeing it everywhere else, right? Kind of, and so it's that hyper-political sensitivity, it's that heightened sensitivity, right, makes you kind of start looking very closely at every action that the government is taking and interpreting it, in the frame that you might have in mind. So I would just say kind of be careful about that, because, politicians really, they are very earnest, and, they're trying to work in your best interest. Yeah, and so just for societies, I guess it's the same, some of the same things that politicians are facing in terms of we have to strike a real balance there. With my job, I have to be able to walk into any congressional office and have them understand that I respect them and that I'm here to work with them, and that I might have a position that's different from theirs, and that's okay, and that we should talk about that. We should talk about why we hold our different positions and what kind of our shared interests are. I mean, when you're doing any kind of lobbying or advocacy, I think your main goal is to really make a connection with the other person's values, right? And so that's kind of why I say kind of do your homework, find out, the different background of the congressional reps that you might see, or your elected representatives, and then understand how you can kind of fit your argument into their value system. And so, I do this regularly, not now because we're during the shutdown, but, I can really walk into any congressional office and I can, pick up on some clues if I haven't done background on them, and I can say what's on your desk these days, what's in your portfolio, what kind of scientific issues are you facing, and they'll say, well, copper contamination in San Francisco Bay. And I go, oh, great, here's why you like physics, right? So everything that I do, I have to be able to relate it to physics, but I try and put it into their frame. But the best advice that I really do give to scientists when they're thinking about doing policy is to be dispassionate. And so in the same way that you approach, I would say, your science, right? You might feel very passionately about it and believe in it and want to explain it and share it and make advances and understand that it's an important contribution. But you're also going to analytically look at the data and see what the conclusions are there. And so I think that's what scientists, one of the strengths that scientists bring to doing advocacy is that we have analytical minds, and we can kind of think through problems on a different level. I know some of the scientists that have ended up working in Congress as congressional staff have talked about how they could see patterns in some of the policy problems that they were working on that other people didn't really see. So you bring a lot of these skills when you do the advocacy. And so, part of it is just a little bit suspending any kind of political orientation you might have and just thinking how to best tackle the problem. So now I'm just going to transition a little bit. I have 4 slides to just tell you a little bit about what the American Institute of Physics does. And these are kind of categories of advocacy and certain advocacy activities that any of the physics student organizations could consider doing and joining into some of these groups or joining into some of these efforts. So for AIP, our government relations efforts really rest on three kind of pillars, is what I call them. One would be news and information, the other advocacy, and then the third being professional development. And so, you know, you have to think first with news and information, you need to have an informed constituency. And so we have a science policy newsletter and that you can sign up for. It's called FYI and it's free. And then we also just recently started doing some expert studies or expert panel reports. So the first one that we did was Is There in Purple? It came out in January and it's about systemic racism, systemic underrepresentation of African Americans in physics. It's a fascinating endeavor. I have huge respect for it because it really talks, it comes from the student perspective. It's a peer-reviewed study, but they did go and interview a lot of Black physics students and ask them about the challenges that they're facing, and, you know, also Black students that used to be physics majors and aren't physics majors, and why did they leave? And so a lot of the report is about culture. It's about inclusiveness and belonging within the physics community. And it's a fascinating read, and that the report provides kind of this guide for change management within each of the physics departments. And so after this, we've gotten some funding from outside group to do some workshops. And so we'll be doing workshops with bunches of physics departments across the country to help them think through change management and how they can best kind of work that into their department. And then recently we did a report on just the impacts of the COVID pandemic on the physical sciences. And this is really just more of like a cataloging of all the different industries that we reach, all the different academics that we reach, certainly a lot of the national laboratories and all of that stuff. And it's more of a look at what the impacts are. It doesn't really kind of go into an advocacy kind of position. It just states, you know, these are what we think the impacts are going to be, so that it provides good foundation for having a conversation about how you want to kind of tackle those impacts. So I'll just talk a little bit more next about kind of some of our advocacy efforts. And you'll start to see that we're very community-based with a lot of the work that we do. And so there are community coalitions within the science policy community here in DC. And the science policy community is largely comprised of many universities, academic institutions, and scientific societies. And so you have, you know, all the different societies at the table in terms of AGU or APS and OSA, the Optical Society. So there's lots of organizations there. We have IEEE, the engineering societies. And so anybody that's really kind of in technical fields has the opportunity to join some of these groups. And so there's groups that advocate for NSF, for the Department of Energy, for NASA. And then there's some groups that kind of cross sectors a little bit. One of those is the Innovation Task Force. And so that's where we have an industry chair there from IBM, and you have academic institutions and scientific societies coming together there. We work on STEM education, so there's a STEM education coalition, and then there's also a physical sciences education coalition. So, you know, there's definitely different groups that you can join. These groups meet monthly. And we do a lot of advocacy through letters and statements that we'll kind of draft these letters and statements. And you have probably from a range of maybe like 25 to maybe 45 groups that are part of each of these coalitions. And so, we'll draft letters on different issues that are kind of pending for our community, and then we'll get sign on by multiple organizations and, kind of use those letters to approach Congress with, the sense of our community. And a lot of those letters are addressed to Congress, right? Or the president, whoever it is that is in authority there. And then we just, obviously we create ad hoc groups as issues come up. And so these are some of the ones that we've recently done. So this is just to give you a little bit of a taste of, what AIP, in addition to the coalition work. So we sign on to these letters. You might have heard about kind of fly-in days or congressional visit days. We organize those for some of our member societies. So just next month, for example, we're going to do our first virtual Congressional Visit Day with the Physics Teachers Association. And so they have about 7 people, and we'll make appointments with all of their congressional reps, and we'll go and do virtual meetings with them. And that's a really, I would say, before the pandemic, that face-to-face interaction was incredibly important. And I would say the virtual interface is incredibly important. When you visit a congressional office or congressional staff and you're there talking to them, it's so much more than just the issue that you want to discuss with that congressional representative. A lot of messages that you're conveying just by being there is to say, I know how this system works. I understand how to be political. I understand, how to ask for what I want. And it's largely, in a lot of ways, also saying, if you cut my programs or if you cut our field, we know how to make an issue out of that. Right. So it's not in a bad way, but you're just letting them know that we're politically astute enough to navigate this space. Right. Even if we're not from, kind of your world as politicians. Right. But you're saying, we're watching and we're able to mobilize. Right. So and then, occasionally we lobby for different language within bills. We'll also do some on student advocacy. You might have heard, well, in the US, there's a group, of course, the name escapes me at this point. Oh, it's called the CASE workshop. It's catalyzing student advocacy workshop that. And so we helped actually found that kind of group. It's they bring students in every year, once a year, and they do like a 3 or 4 day event where they kind of teach you how to do advocacy, talk you through your options. And then we had one of our students that we sent to the conference had gone back and actually established a science policy club in his university. And so I would say within the last about 10 years, you see a decent amount of science student advocacy groups kind of starting to pop up across the US. The first to start was MIT, and they just did this, bang up job, right, kind of right out of the gate. And so, within the policy community, and I think also within the academic community, people were saying, how do we have more of this? And so there was a lot of efforts over the last, I would say, 5 to 10 years to build up student programs. And this is, I think, my last slide, and it's just as far as to talk to you about, like, we do dive into some very specific issues sometimes. And so the example that is my favorite is plutonium-238, which is the nuclear material they use in deep space missions. So this is on the rover, and they use it to keep the thermal generators going when there's no solar power available. And the US had actually stopped making plutonium-238 during the 80s, back in the Cold War, when we were all kind of reducing our nuclear activity. And so we had been buying this from the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union had an amount. I guess they had a stockpile, I don't know, you know. And then they started getting a little reluctant to sell it to us. And so we had to figure out how to restart domestic production of plutonium-238, right, which is no small feat. And so we had to go around and lobby to the different congressional offices for this. And this is an issue that had bubbled up from the community, specifically the astronomers had brought this to our attention. So we put together a small group, and we did a lot of work to kind of figure out how to get some money to get this started. And we did get a $10 million appropriation for that back in, I think it was probably 8 years ago now. And so it's been funded at $10 million every year since then. And we do produce plutonium-238 now in the US. And then, you know, the other really interesting thing about my job is that it's always new, right? It's kind of in that there's always new issues coming up, right? So, you know, certainly we're now working on things like immigration and distance learning and racial equity, because those are the issues that are facing our community. And we will go and do advocacy, you know, around any of the issues that our community kind of brings up to us. And so one of the other things that's interesting right now is we're thinking about unemployment for physics teachers. You know, because of the pandemic, all the state budgets are really under some stress. And so we're thinking about if states are going to have to start laying off teachers because they don't have enough money to pay them, which teachers are going to go first. And it could, you know, science is certainly an easy one because in the US, there's standardized testing on English and math, but there's no standardized testing on science. And so, you know, as long there's kind of this philosophy to teach to the test. And as long as your test scores are pretty good, then your school's rated pretty good. But science isn't in that mix. And so it's kind of easy to let it go by. It's also resource intensive. So hopefully I have given you, stop sharing my screen, a little bit of feeling for how we do the advocacy here in the US in physics.
Thank you very much, Jen. This was an extremely interesting presentation. And I think we got to really understand the activity of IAP. And I think I've gotten great material to ask you some questions later on in our session. But first, I will give the word to Maikel to give us a talk about the Canadian Association of Physicists.
Perfect. Thank you very much. Thank you very much for having me. I'm very happy to be here and talk about science and science policy. So first of all, I'm the Director of Science Policy at the Canadian Association of Physicists. I'm also wearing different hats. I'm also the Associate Chair of grad studies here in the department. We have about 100 grad students. So I work with students. I know what their hopes are, what their concerns are, what kind of problems they may have when they go through master's and PhD. I'm also an active researcher. So I'm trying to get funding for my research. I'm trying to get funding to support students. I'm involved. I'm working with agencies. I'm involved in reviewing proposals and funding decisions. So it's a constant question, where should agencies put money? What are the hot research topics and so on? And I'm also a mentor and supervisor for the students in my lab. So for me, a constant question, a constant struggle is what kind of training should I provide in my lab to prepare students for their careers, and what kind of careers will there be? And I think these four fields kind of go hand in hand, because we train students for future careers, but on the other hand, what are these careers? And the conditions, the bigger conditions, are set by the politicians eventually. So all these decisions go hand in hand. Only when the politicians take the right decisions, when we steer the country and the economy and the society in the right way, there will be jobs eventually for the students, and then we can provide the training that our students need to get these jobs in the future. So, and that's kind of my role at the Canadian Association of Physicists. We try to bring all these things together to take the right decisions and make the right suggestions to the politicians to have a big global impact in a way. So what we do is we try to communicate. We try to talk about science. We have about 700 members, which is very small as compared to what Jen talked about. So Canada is smaller than the US. So we're talking about 1,700 physicists, which are members of our association. We represent different fields, from condensed matter physics to biological physics, medical physics, subatomic particle physics, and so on. So we have a very diverse group that we represent. We try to talk about science. We try to talk about the importance of science. So we invite and we include politicians in our events. We invite them to our conferences. They come, they give presentations, they answer questions, and so on. Every year, the Canadian government invites suggestions for the federal budget for next year. And we are very active in trying to proposing budgets that support science, that support students, that support funding for science, and so on. We more and more, of course, use social media as well. More and more politicians use social media. So we try to be on social media as well. We reach out, we post. We mainly try to post success stories. A lot of what you see is students being successful in their careers, students winning awards, members winning awards. We try to communicate a very positive picture of science and the success of science and that people have in science, and the impact of science on society when there's a nice finding, and so on. We try to contact politicians directly, what Jen talked about, which is becoming harder and harder. And I think we will talk about this more and more, because we have to understand we are only one voice of many voices in this society. And our voice is not more valuable than the other voices as well, because this is a democracy. So it is sometimes very difficult to reach the politicians and get our point through. And we also have to understand that we are part of a bigger picture. So we try to provide a solution, a complete solution for them, and not just like push one particular aspect forward. We are also part of other organizations like what Jen is. So of course there are physicists, there's chemists, there are biologists in Canada as well. And there are some societies where we work together to have a bigger voice. We also try to be present on Parliament Hill. We have offices close to the Parliament, close to the government. We offer, there's weekly coffee, breakfasts on Parliament Hill, where we invite politicians, where our people are there for chats, for questions and answers, and so on. So if they have a question, we want to be there. We want to provide solutions. We want to be a partner that they can talk to, a knowledgeable partner. And then a lot of what we do is also starts very early. We approach high school students. We approach undergraduate students. We work with graduate students, because one big thing is that we have to have an impact on the education. We want to train and educate high school students to go into science, the importance of science. And this is the one thing that we think is important here, because our economy is largely based now on high tech, on new developments. We all need like these things, you know, these super duper computers and phones, or like these things that I have in my ear. We all like them. But if we want to make them, we have to train people in science, engineering. But on the high school level, often people are scared away from science. People tell them, oh, this is too difficult for you. And there's other issues as well with minorities. And so people, even if they're smart enough, they are scared away from going into science, which is a weird thing, because our wealth is based on